Sir Andrew Motion. Do people tend to call you Sir Andrew or
No.
Andrew?
Well, it depends who they are, rather. Bureaucrats call me Sir Andrew, and head teachers and that sort of thing. But after they've done it once, I tell them not to. Some people rather deliberately don't call me that. I mean, I see that they know that in some sense that they should be calling me that, but I can see them deciding not to.
What shall I call you?
Andrew,
Okay.
please.
Would you please count us down once the battery goes in?
I will.
Here we go.
4, 3, 2, go.
What do you think are the essential differences between poetry and prose?
There are two essential differences. One is a formal one and one is the rest of it. And the formal difference is that by and large, there are exceptions, but by and large, the lines in a piece of prose go to the edge of the page and the lines in a poem don't. And when they don't, almost infinite variety of things happens. And the other difference is that whereas, or rather although, a piece of prose is perfectly well able to deliver a very strong emotional content, it makes you laugh, it makes you cry, I think that poetry has a access to our strong feelings that is more powerful than any other kind of written form. So for me, that's a crucial difference.
How important is rhyme, or can rhyme be in poetry?
It's part of the answer to the first question. It's very important. It doesn't have to be there. After all, Paradise Lost doesn't rhyme, and that's one of the great poems in the English language. But rhyme helps to create the acoustic world that is part of the meaning world that a poem has. If we ask ourselves where meaning resides in a poem, I think we must say that it has as much to do with the noise that the poem makes as it does to do with the sense of the words written down on the page.
So is reading poetry out loud very important then?
And it follows from that precisely that reading poetry aloud is incredibly important, partly because it allows you to own the poem in a way that isn't matched by any other sort of reading of it, and partly because you hear it and allow other people to hear it in a way that transmits meaning and adds to that sense of ownership.
What are you trying to achieve when you write a poem?
I think I'm trying to understand something in myself, some emotional thing in myself, and to present it in a way that will then allow other people to recognise it and understand it in themselves too, even perhaps just rather fleetingly. And what that thing is, in my case, is usually to do with feelings about other people, and in particular feelings about death. I mean, that is my subject.
Do you think that people find unintended meaning in some of your work?
Well, the idea of intention in a poem, the notion of intention in a poem is a complicated one, because if we think that a poet, him or herself, doesn't know entirely the meaning of their own poem, and I don't think they ever do, because a good poem balances what is known and what's unknown pretty equally. If all that is true, then other people can read more or less whatever they like into a poem, and the poet should feel happy about it, provided, with the proviso that they haven't got the facts of it wrong. They shouldn't say it's set during the night when it's clearly set during the day.
You've written a novel, Silver, Return to Treasure Island. As a poet, what was it like writing so extensively in prose?
Well, even though formally it's a very different sort of operation, clearly, because the lines go to the end of the page, I wrote that book in a state of excitement that was rather like the state that I tend to write my poems in. I'd recently stood down as Poet Laureate. A little time before that, my father had died. I'd recently met and got married again. So I was in a state of exaltation, really, sort of scored through with sadness about my father. And that meant that when I sat down to write, which was very early in the morning, I wrote it sort of between 5:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning for a year or so. I was in this weird trance-like, as it felt at the time, state, which is a bit like what I'm in when I'm writing poems. But of course there are opportunities for formal experimentation that a poem has that don't apply here.
How do you look back now at your decades as Poet Laureate?
I was very pleased to do it, honoured to do it, and very pleased to have the chance to set up some of the things that I did, including and especially the Poetry Archive, which is an archive of poets reading their own work, an online thing that has a vast audience now. I felt taxed by the question of commissioned work. Can be difficult, that.
Was that a pressure?
Yeah, there is a pressure. It's insidious, but it's definitely there. Nobody comes around from the palace, certainly, with a silver tray and a stiff card on it saying, I want you to write about this. But there's a sort of baying noise in the press whenever anything significant happens, and they expect you to write something, and you might be able to do it in a way that connects with the true self of your writedliness. But sometimes that's simply impossible. So that can exert a pressure. So I was very pleased to do it, and very pleased to give it out, which is a nice thing to be able to say.
How did you come to poetry in the first place?
My parents weren't readers. My mum read a little bit. My dad read hardly at all. He used to claim that he'd read half a book in his life, which was The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes. And there was no expectation whatsoever that I would go on to lead a life which was to do with writing in any way. I was either going to work for the Forestry Commission or the RSPB, so I had a brilliant English teacher.
How do you wind down outside work?
I cook and I fish.
And that is 5 minutes. And just before we stop, this is cheating, but for those people who aren't into poetry, where would you suggest they begin?
I think they should buy a big fat anthology of poetry, and when they hit somebody that they like, they should persevere, go and get that person's individual collection. And when they don't like it, they should turn over the page and wait until they get to somebody who they feel is more sympathetic to them.
Very good to see you.
Good to see you, and thank you.